Hi, this is Milani Douglas from the National Museum of Women in the Arts, and today we are having another episode of the Curative Collective. The Curative Collective conversations are with community members, community projects that are working at the intersection of art, social change, and food. Since we're doing the project Reclamation, we have had some wonderful organizations reach out, some wonderful projects, and I was so excited when I got an inbox message from Evelyn Ridds, and she told me about her amazing project. Evelyn, how are you today?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
I've had a chance to dive in myself, so I feel like I have a little bit of more information. Like I feel like I've done this deep dive. I would love to hear you talk about your project and then give us a chance to even go through some of the information that you have for us.
Absolutely. That sounds great.
Thank you. So we're going to put up her presentation because she has some amazing slides for us. And then that way you can walk through it and just tell us some things about it.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I have a few images that I hope will paint the picture of what it's like to participate in a comida casera exchange or to come to a public programming workshop, a participatory installation. The project has taken different forms. So you'll see in this next image, the project started in my backyard in 2016. I started the project as a way to bring together women from different generations, from different fields, neighborhoods, backgrounds, to all come together to share food and stories inspired by a woman from mother, abuela, mentor, lover to friend, someone who had given them the sense of home, someone who had really had a big impact in shaping their sense of home and belonging. So it started in my backyard, inviting people from friends, neighbors, acquaintances, colleagues, students, mentors, and open invitations to gather in intimate exchanges where people would share a story and a dish inspired by home. In the next slide, you'll be able to see a few different gatherings. The project started in my backyard and quickly expanded to different spaces, from libraries to museums to universities, galleries, community centers. And as the format changed and opened and expanded, so did participants, bringing in more community members from the different sites and locations. So contexts, sites, audiences all opened and expanded. In the next image, you'll see a multitude of dishes. Often dishes reflect so many common histories of relocation, of immigration, and of the things we bring with us from different tables, different cultures, different generations to the next. You can see dishes from so many parts of the world, and oftentimes participants would share dishes with matriarchal meaning. You can see dishes here from all over. And my own background is one that's really mixed as well. This project was largely inspired by my mother. The title of the project, Comida Casera, means food from home or homemade food, but it can also be a way to describe comfort food. And I was largely inspired by my mom, who I saw share many dishes growing up in acts of generosity and welcoming and hospitality in times of mourning, in times of celebration, and as a way to honor tradition. So while the dishes span from participants over the last 5 years have joined from more than 30 different countries, spanning across 5 continents, and while their stories are diverse, multifaceted experiences of home, something that really links them together, something that ties them together, are these real connections to home, to belonging, and many times common histories of what we take with us from place to place, from home to home. In the next image, you'll see an important part. This is a participant sharing their dish and the story behind their dish. And one of the things I've come to really love about these intimate gatherings is one really integral part of these exchanges, which is about active listening, deep, active, focused listening. Most of the evening is made up of just that, of listening. Participants share their story behind their dish, about the people, the places, the flavors, the foods that have inspired it. And everybody around the table is listening. So most of the night is spent listening, and it kind of depends on both the vulnerability of someone to share a personal and meaningful part of their history with a group of strangers, and also it depends on the group they're actively listening. In the next image, you could see how the project continued to expand. This was part of an installation I created at the ICA watershed called Aquí y Allá Juntos a la Mesa. And the title A la Mesa is meant to bring people together, a call to action, a call to the table to come together, to gather in open exchanges of listening, of nourishment, of coming together. And you can see here someone is standing, sharing their dish as well, as everyone actively is engaged and listening. In the next set of images, I think you'll see a little bit about how the project expanded to the different broader publics. So in the next image, you'll see this installation, Aquí Allá Juntos a la Mesa, which was created in collaboration with the local farm, Isti Farms, and Kanan Thiruvengadam of Isti Farms. And what you see is a table, which was really the center part of this installation, a table full of cracks with really a living table full of different species of edible herbs and maybe lesser known weeds that were also edible, growing together, thriving in a community of many different plants, which was what the table was really aimed to highlight, really amplifying the idea of communities that are mutually supportive and that thrive, that can grow and thrive in community. So around the table were all edible plants, local edible plants grown just down the street at Isti Farm. In the next slide, you can see a little bit more about the table itself, a living table which was regularly activated with public programs. So you can see there's headphones on the table. Participants could listen to over an hour of stories from previous Comida Casera exchanges, and then they could also write down their own memories, drawings, recipes that connected to their people, places, dishes that had formed their sense of home. The table was made with heavy weighted concrete, but also thriving, growing plants that were breaking through those cracks, inspired by sidewalk cracks, inspired by the history of this very industrial site where it existed, but also a kind of symbol, an ecosystem at the center of the table that reflected both resilient and vulnerable communities. In the next slide, you can see there were a lot of activations around the table, from solstice stories to transplant tales to eco walks, to lots of public programming that brought people together to have conversations around ancestral food, around health, around cooking, and around our past, present, and future relationships with food sources. In the next image, you could see this was our last program at the end of a full summer where local chefs came in and had conversations around ancestral food with community members who joined. And also we worked with the harvest. People were invited to cut from the table to eat what was there in a celebration of what we were growing locally. And also chefs did demonstrations and talked about health and growing your own food. In the next slide, you can see that this project, A la Mesa, took many different iterations. This one at the Cooper Gallery really centered on the notion of archives. So many stories, personal histories with a lot of significance. People were invited to archive those stories, maybe stories that hadn't been yet recorded. So a lot of questions about whose stories, what stories get recorded. And the small box is created a space in the center of the table where people could gather. They could listen to stories that were coming from under the table on speakers, and then also add their own recipes, drawings, and stories, adding to a public growing archive. The table was surrounded by wallpapers with different patterns suggesting a multiplicity of perspectives, many different homes, the inside of being at a dining room or kitchen table, and expanding that notion of home to many, many different perspectives. In the next image, you can see some images from a public workshop This workshop was called Forming Home, and participants were invited to come together and create step-by-step instruction booklets. These were inspired largely by my son's Lego manuals that don't rely on language, but instead rely on pictures to give instructions to tell the story of how something is made. So participants use large sheets of colored paper to form their home dishes and to give a kind of step-by-step instruction manual that then became part of a public archive, a library on site. And in the next slide, I think you could see a few more images of how they were made, different sheets and letters, so a huge range of dishes. And there was also small bags of seedlings on site. They were grown on site. Participants could take those and give this living gift to a stranger they met on their walk home, really extending one of the core project ideas of cultivating community. So the people could take those. There was also spray bottles and scissors, so participants could also help cultivate what was growing on site. In the next slide, we come to a more recent project, Recetas de Casa. These are a series of online recipe exchanges from and about home. In the next slide, you'll see this project right before the pandemic. I hosted a recipe exchange at the MFA on International Women's Day here in Boston, and we exchanged recipes. This was maybe a week before quarantine, everything started shutting down. And so I wanted to adapt Comida Casera to be a space for online engagement where people could come together across time zones. People joined from Mumbai to Guayaquil to Boston, Seattle, Houston, Miami, New York, and more. People came together online to share the recipes that were bringing them comfort, healing, that were giving them a sense of nourishment in really challenging times and isolating times during the pandemic. So these were posted online. They were bi-monthly. I hosted one about every other month, and they were open to the public. So we gathered strangers, friends of friends, people to come together to exchange. And they shared their recipes, which were then compiled into a digital cookbook and shared with everyone at the exchange. In the next image, you can see the result of a cookbook that I created from one of the most recent ones, the recent exchange called a charla, or an informal conversation, supported by the US Latinx Art Forum. And these were images of the main ingredient, a kind of portrait honoring the main ingredient in each person's dish on the left, and then on the right, you can see an excerpt from their story. In the next image, you'll see the way a string runs through every story. So although the stories really range in tone, from sweet to complicated memories to comical ones, and they range in place where the stories are from, the sense of home where people are sharing their dish from, ranges as well, but unifying all of them, this thread runs through them. That sense of home, that sense of belonging and comfort is that thread that's sort of drawn through each one. In the next slide, you can see one more example of that, and really seeing how each person's dish was framed and honored as part of these exchanges, then shared with all the participants. So that's just a little bit about the project I wanted to share, and I hope Melanie and I can now be in conversation a little bit more, but I just wanted to introduce and give a little background to the project.
The project is absolutely beautiful, and I feel like when you sent me the project, my temptation was just to call you immediately. Like, I was like, I need to talk to her now. But then I was like, I thought it would be so good for us just to have this first moment of actually really, really getting a chance to talk. I feel like we've been living in like these kind of like parallel universes with a lot of other artists that are reclaiming the space of the domestic space, of the power of what happens at the kitchen table, the power of what happens in memory and recipes and food, the transfer of knowledge. And I just wanted to know, like, in your travels, as you've been able to put together the project, what has been some of the patterns, or what have you seen also happening in the world around us before COVID? Because there was that, I've been thinking about this. The first time I wrote Reclamation was in 2015. And there are a couple other projects that happened right at that moment at 2015, 2016, that it seems like we're all kind of flowing forward in the same path. So what are some things that you've seen as the project has evolved for you and your ties to other artists?
Yeah, I love that question. I think one thing that feels really constant is what a connective material food is, how it can link us to people and places of the past that are still connected to those of the present, how it can be a way to celebrate and honor differences, how it can be a way to intentionally resist assimilation, how it can be a way to connect us across so many divides, and at the same time a way to really help build a lot of common ground. So I feel like whether they're through online engagement or participatory installations or workshops or comida casera dinner exchanges, I think that that has been such a sort of connective material. The other thing that's happened, whether in whatever format and whatever place, are also lasting friendships. Maybe people who wouldn't have come together, a student, an old student of mine with a past mentor, or people living in different cities who have joined online to gather, a group of strangers who otherwise may have not met, and yet have formed lasting friendships because they're not talking necessarily about themselves, where they work, what they do, or quick small talk, right? But they're sharing something, they're being vulnerable, they're sharing something really meaningful, and that's really formed their connection to home, to belonging. And I think people really, really slowly build relationship. That space and time for slow relationship building feels like an integral part that's activated through that kind of really deep listening that can happen at these types of exchanges.
So let's talk about that. I'm so glad that you brought up the slow relationship building time, because I think that in that space between when you are an artist, when you are a professor, because you are a professor, correct? Okay, so you're artist, professor, and your projects, because they're participatory, require a level of arts administration that's at a higher level, I would say, than, well, let's just say it's different. If you have a studio practice and you're trying to get into galleries and you have a participatory project and the community element is so important, the time that it takes to build the relationships. Can you talk about the time that it takes, the time that's required, so that from an institutional perspective, people can get a better understanding of what that takes?
Yeah, I think it is a very slow process. And so much of my creative practice, whether it's in my studio or whether it's organizing these kinds of events and bringing people together, I have learned to really embrace that slowness as a way to build intimacy, as a way to develop meaningful connections, as a way to pay attention to, in my own creative practice, to slow handmade craft that is a kind of resistance and a rejection to the quick expectations and demands of our day-to-day, both the kind of expectations of consumption and of production. So I feel like it's a form of resistance to that pace, but also a way to create really meaningful relationships and exchanges. So I think that slowness is really critical. And the events themselves are formed through listening, which also takes a lot of time.
It does.
So, and to answer your question, the administration, yeah, it's become this sort of hosting, I think, has become a natural part of my practice, but it does it does require sort of individual cultivation as well as broader open community ones. I've had the experience of working with a lot of education teams at different museums that I've shared through some of the pictures, and I have found that really wonderful to work with education teams to create a space that is really focused on public engagement. And so I have found that really helpful. And then in my own teaching practice, I've learned a lot from that kind of space, what it means to make everyone in the class feel welcome, what it means to feel like everyone in the classroom has a voice and a voice that's really heard. And I think these spaces, the Comida Casera spaces, are really about honoring a multiplicity of voices. That project, A La Mesa, is really about highlighting everyone having a seat at the table, but also a voice, and how we thrive in those spaces that have multiple perspectives, multiple voices coming together.
When you are working with your students, or even when you're in your as a professor, how what is the gap between explaining to students or explaining to a school that you're working with, or any administrator, the time that's necessary to build and cultivate these relationships? And what are some of your strategies? I think, and the reason that I'm asking is because I think I see more participatory art becoming a part of what museums are doing and what they're featuring. And I see this kind of like movement towards that. Some museums are way ahead of the curve. They've been doing it for quite some time. And after it's done, it's always like, oh my God, this was like the best thing. But that initial push to the other side, it requires some strategies to get people to slow down, as you say, because, and be process oriented versus results driven. So what are some strategies that you use to talk about your project and to engage other communities, institutions, and your students into the process?
I think the kinds of spaces, the process, as you said, focusing on the process over the product, I think that's really important, which is something that's centered in my teaching practice. It's really focused on that process, and in really thinking about building intimate exchanges. I think the slowness of it is very, very, is kind of invisible. Like good film editing, you don't see it. You don't even notice it or pay attention to it. Or when people come to your house, you want to make them feel comfortable, like everything just magically appeared. You don't see the work. So I think part of the work is making it feel for all participants as effortless and as welcoming as possible. So strategy, to answer your question about strategies, I think in terms of this project, one of the things that I've done in terms of slowness and time is reach out to people individually. I find that can be really helpful. And keeping a running list of anyone who expresses interest, people who write emails who I don't know, or someone who says, I can't go, but my friend's sister would like to come. So kind of keeping a list and taking the time to reach out. So I think individual connections can be really important, and just making it a natural part of that process. In the classroom, I think it can be about similarly linking people together who don't already know each other, who don't already come in sitting in groups. And at the same time, or the same way at Comida Casera dinners, I intentionally make place cards and make sure nobody is sitting by someone that they know, so that it really is about forming new relationships across all kinds of divides, cultural, geographic. People can be in very siloed neighborhoods as well. So while the project can kind of build community and strengthen bonds within a neighborhood, it can also be a way to disrupt those silos within that as well. So it can also be a way of crossing political, geographic, economic, all kinds of divides. And that's really, I think, at the core of the relationship building in the project.
I love how this communication about the relationship building, the slowing down, and even modeling it. I wanted to also ask you, when it comes to creating the space where people are sharing this kind of intimate detail, the power of giving people permission by giving different placements. What have you seen happen by just kind of initiating that first step for people that gives them that kind of permission?
Yeah, I think the first step is maybe in the beginning, people might feel a little uncomfortable coming to a space, entering whether it's a virtual or physical space or a workshop, and not knowing anyone. But I think some really beautiful friendships have been formed that last well beyond the event. And to me, that's a great kind of evidence of how connections can be formed through opening up, through that kind of trust, through generosity, through hospitality. People are sharing food with strangers, or they're sharing a really personal history. And the stories are very fluid as well, as people are sharing. So they're also very fluid, multilingual spaces. People are moving and shifting very comfortably between languages, between dialects, between cultural customs, even just in introducing one's dish, just in saying the name of the dish, or in quoting a family member, or even in sharing a full story in another language. We're sort of moving very naturally between languages. And that's even my kitchen table was like that. It went back and forth between English and Spanish. There was a lot of Spanglish, and I think many households are like that as well. So I want the table also to be very intentionally welcoming, opening of many different kinds of language and cultural customs.
And so that's I'm so glad you brought that up as far as like the different language and the different cultures that happen in the table. And because sometimes I think that people think that you're only speaking a different language at home if it's a different language recognized by society. And so what I mean by that, even in a let's say that if you're in a space where everyone is speaking Spanish, even when you go to work, when you come home, there is a different language. There's a different Spanish that happens at the table with your family that is not the same as the Spanish that you're speaking at work, on the way to work, and it's the same in my community, African American community. There's a different English, there's a different language that's happening, nuances that are happening. And that's such an important part of the food, and a part of the food that's shared and how we share it. Can you give one example of something that is maybe nonverbal, a nonverbal transfer of knowledge or information that happens at the table that is like that thing that, could be missed. It could be slightly missed. And if you need me to give you an example from my own life, I can. But if you know exactly what I'm talking about, then please let me know.
Yeah, I love this question. Because it makes me think about these little magic moments that happen where you're when you're sitting there, right? That maybe you don't see right away, but that you feel and experience. I think one of them comes through this active listening I was talking about earlier. That sense where everybody's eyes are really focused on one person. So where it's common for us to be on the phone scrolling, skimming, zooming, in these exchanges, the phones are put away and people are actively not listening, but really looking up, honoring the person who's speaking, who's honoring someone else who's been meaningful. So that kind of looking. I think the other thing is the passing of the serving to a stranger, the holding a dish and serving it is really an act of generosity, but also of trusting someone you haven't met before, not only to try their food, but also to be served. So the dish kind of circulates around the table and people are consuming that story and sharing. So I think those are two examples, in addition to these kind of multi-fluid spaces, different languages.
So it's so fascinating that you brought up about the passing of the food, because that's exactly what I'm talking about when you have this nuanced moment. So in one version of it, the food is on the table, everyone kind of grabs their own thing. Another version, plates are passed, and that's just another level of intimacy to have whoever is at the table holding your plate, right, as it goes around. Another version is letting someone put the food on your plate, right? And then another version is where they actually hold your plate and then they're actually serving your plate and talking to you about, do you want a little bit more of this, a little bit more of that, oh, a little less of this, do you even like? And so those very nuanced moments that I think in the way that we identify fine art, it can be hard to recognize that kind of nuance at the table the same way you would recognize the nuance in a paint stroke, or the different kind of material, or the change of one material as it bleeds into another. And I think it's that both are art, have their own space to be studied. So it's just beautiful to even have a chance to, talk about it in exchange. And this is why I didn't call you first, because I was like, no, I want us to talk about it live.
I love that. I love that parallel and that connection. I think one of the connections that you're bringing up that I love is that both are forms of care. That sort of brush mark, right, that you're highlighting is the act of someone being really intentional, or the care of that mark a careful kind of observation or whether it came from imagination. It's a mark of care that you could find in these nuanced moments that you're describing in the example of the painting. In the same way, there are these nuances that, like the act of listening or the passing of food, that become symbols of care, that can build really healthy communities. So I love that you brought that up. So really beautiful parallel.
I also think that there's a level of care to recognize when you are not at that level yet, right? When you say, oh, we're not ready for that next level of intimacy. Pardon me, we have school going on in the background. So you know how that goes. But I think that there is a level of care that says, oh, that says, that can automatically read that this person is comfortable with me passing them the plate, but not necessarily serving them the plate, and honoring, kind of where you are and letting it evolve as well. Because I think that what is so beautiful about these spaces is that there's this wide exploratory space between you and this other person, and all these little nuanced activities that can determine the level of intimacy, the opportunities for vulnerability, the opportunities for relationship that can be changed immediately by how deeply you listen or how you just honor where they are and where you are. So it's so fascinating. Now, what are your challenges and opportunities when it comes to archiving these nuanced moments that are happening?
Yeah, I think that's a challenge that I realized later on. In the beginning, I hosted them. I didn't think of them as a project or part of my practice. I was just hosting them really as a way to bring people together from many different backgrounds. And I didn't archive them for a couple of years. I think the first 2 years, 2016, 17, it wasn't until 2018 that I started to work with Mel Tang, a photographer, and asked her to take a portrait of each person's dish and the hands. So each portrait is very intentionally formed. It's the hands holding a dish out towards the photographer, so as if handing to you. And it's a portrait of each dish. And I've also began archiving the stories just on my phone, just recording people's stories. So you can hear the voices, the place where their voice cracks, the place where they really get excited. There's a few of those on the project website, but those voices were also shared on the headphones under the table in the installation. So people could hear a range of stories from many different generations and backgrounds, and could hear the different tones, the different accents, right? So all of that was picked up in the voice, but it did take a while to archive. And then more recently, I've been collecting people's recipes during the pandemic, and working with those to share them and create a public archive of people's recipes that are meaningful, that maybe haven't been archived. Maybe there were somebody's that they haven't archived. And the project, I'm just thinking of hearing your child's voice and seeing your cat and loving the something that happens in the project, which is very flexible and very fluid and adaptive. So, for example, at a very recent one, somebody asked, "My friend wants to come, but they don't speak English. Can they come?" I said, "Of course, we'll translate." And then it was very easy to do so. Somebody said, "I don't have a sitter. Can I bring my baby?" Of course, bring your baby. So the project is also open, flexible, fluid. It tries to adapt to different spaces and things that are happening in people's lives.
Yes, and that is one practice that I'm excited about seeing how it shows up in museums, how it shows up in schools, universities, how it shows up in programs, and just our overall practice. The rewards of slowing down and the rewards of relationships, and how do we make sure that they are honored and that they are viewed as an asset, the same way that we have our financial ledgers and there's this kind of like tangible asset that we honor. We want to make sure that in spaces that we're also honoring the personal relationship, the relationship assets as well, and how we are building and cultivating them and investing in them as well. When you decided to archive them, definitely, so picking a, having your photographer, have you also collaborated with artists to come up with some of the concepts as far as the design of the space or how you view the space? Or how do you even take that in your own self and take the time for you to be able to create these concepts?
I think that each iteration, that, for example, the different A la Mesa participatory installations and the public programs that activated those tables tended to be really responsive to the site and to the audience or the community. So whether one's on a university and maybe we have new students coming, so a lot of the designs, for example, the Forming Home workshop booklets, those were specifically designed for communities of new students. So thinking about what it means to welcome somebody maybe who's come from a different place, who's entering a new community, but who might easily connect to others through a home dish or a recipe. Again, a really strong connective material. So they often respond and adapt to site. The installation, for example, at the ICA watershed, the table inspired by sidewalk cracks, that was really inspired by thinking of the vulnerability, the oppressive weight of industrial expansion, but also the resilience of thriving together in community. And it was a response to the site, to the location as well. So it feels like they really adapt to or respond to particular sites, context, and expand and change and are activated by new communities on each site as well. And that also informs the sort of response in the next iteration.
And I can tell that that's all work that's inspired by taking the time to actively listen, to have the time to process what you've heard, and be in community for what you're doing. I know that you and I, we could probably, we clearly could talk for hours and hours. So I want to just encourage people to look at your project, to see what it's about, to see how you can participate where you are, and see if there's a way to support the work that Evelyn's doing. Maybe invite her out to do it, and then also, or contribute from where you are. And also take some time to be able to look at reclamation. We are opening up recipe submissions again, July 5th. We are wanting to hear, last time we opened up, it was really around the fall into the winter. And now we want to go more into the spring. So here's some of those recipes that are about gathering in this time period and what that may be for you. And so please feel free to share them, be a part of this art exhibition at the National Museum of Women in the Arts. Stay tuned for what we're doing. And then, Evelyn, I know that you and I will find some of the ways to continue to collaborate or to move forward, and be also to be included in this project. But I really appreciate you taking the time today for us to talk about the project.
Thank you. I've loved being in conversation. I hope we'll continue our conversation.
Yeah, I want to show you my pizza, and I want to say that I cleaned
Yes,
it well.
I hope that
So
I hope that we
my place
will.
got clean.
And if you all could just stay tuned, follow Reclamation, follow Evelyn's project, look her up. She's on Instagram and then also has a website for it. And then we will continue the conversation. And please look at, if you have any submissions for Reclamation for July 5th, that would be great. Put them up on the website. It's pretty easy to submit. We have had some great stories with family memories. We've had people submit pictures. If you're not comfortable submitting a recipe or remedy, you can submit a picture. You can submit a picture of the dish and be able to support the project that way. Reclamation is brought to you in partnership with 1015 Multimedia and the Family Arts Museum. We are glad and so appreciative of our community partners that we've been able to showcase through our culture, our Curative Collective event. And so glad to have you in the number, Evelyn, as we talk about your project. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
All right, everyone. We'll see you next Monday for our next episode of Curative Collective. Have a wonderful day.